I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I think Berlin is my favorite city outside the United States. I came here to study German as a young man. The city was so interesting I didn't go to the class all the time, so I should be better at German when you consider all the time I spent.
That's okay.
And also want to thank not only the organizer of Rainer Funk for inviting me, but also I know these conferences take a lot of work, and there's a lot of other people, students and others, who did a tremendous amount of work to just make this happen, and I want to thank them. Okay, my title is Fromm, Marx, and Humanism. However, it's not all of Fromm on these topics, which could take a book. Someone should write, but someone should write a dissertation on this, but not me. So my focus is going to be primarily in the United States and primarily during the early 1960s, so about 1961 to 1965. Just focusing on that aspect. This is part of a longer essay that I'm writing that's going to appear in a book on humanism, kind of trying to revive radical humanism and critiquing the post-structuralists and so forth, but that book is not out yet. Now, Fromm is and this has been mentioned before in this conference, that he's often underestimated by critical social theorists and philosophers in the academy, who characterize him as a liberal idealist, or as a simplistic liberal idealist, or as a popularizer who lacked rigor, in contrast to other members of the Frankfurt School, like the melancholy Theodor Adorno, who has a stellar academic reputation, and also in America. Although not as big a one, but solid. None deny, however, that it was Fromm who first introduced the Frankfurt School to a form of Freudian Marxism that was at the root of their subsequent efforts to theorize authoritarian personality. This secret's been out on that, for 40 years, since Martin Jay's book. By the 1950s, with publications like The Art of Loving, 1956, Fromm seemed to be entering the American mainstream, perhaps even moving from Marxism and radicalism to Cold War liberalism, as so many others were doing in this period. A lot of radical intellectuals who moved toward fairly mainstream positions. This certainly was what Herbert Marcuse seemed to suggest in Eros and Civilization, which led to a sharp exchange with Fromm in the left liberal journal Dissent. A lot of us are aware of that debate. However, a closer look at Fromm's writings in this period shows a far different picture. The same year as this debate with Marcuse, in the same society, Fromm began to put forward a humanist interpretation of Marxist thought, extolling Marx's humanism as one of the major answers to what he called the decay and dehumanization behind the glamour and wealth and political power of Western society. So that's 1955. Now, if you jump to 1961, this is the book Marx's Concept of Man. There, Fromm foregrounded his Marxist humanist position, writing that this is Fromm's words now, Marx's theory does not assume that the main motive of man is one of material gain. Furthermore, the very aim of Marx is to liberate man from the pressure of economic needs so that he can be fully human, that Marx is primarily concerned with the emancipation of man as an individual, the overcoming of alienation, the restoration of his capacity to relate himself fully to man and to nature. There's a difficulty. English is a hard language to write about this kind of stuff in, because you get stuck in this gender binary, because German, very fortunately, has the word Mensch, Menschen, in addition to Mann. But English simply, when you say Mensch in English, it becomes a man. When you say Mann in English, that becomes a man also. Fromm is, when Marx talks of it, he always says Menschen. He never says man, Mann, Männer, Mensch, Menschen. Fromm is restricted by English, and of course, nowadays we have this, we say he or she, or we take it to the plural, and that's. But I guess especially since I work in gender studies, I guess, because man, I'll just keep repeating the word man. But here it stands for human beings, as Fromm is using it. Okay. Fromm's and Marx's notion of human emancipation is predicated on a vision of a new society, not as a distant or imaginary utopia, but as a real possibility that exists as a tendency, not inevitably, but as a tendency inside the very structures of capitalist society itself. For the first time since the Neolithic Revolution subjected laboring populations to unremitting toil, this third stage, in order to achieve a surplus product that helped to create the first class societies, the vast productive apparatus created by capitalism makes possible for the future sharply reduced hours of labor alongside material abundance. This possibility is of course conditioned by the danger that the system might first annihilate humanity in nuclear war or irrevocably damage the global ecological system, which it's in a very big hurry to do. With Marx's concept of man, Fromm probably did more than any other individual to introduce the young Marx, the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, to the English-speaking public, also bringing the notion of a socialist humanism to the fore. Marx's concept of man, published in 1961, consists of a 90-page introductory essay by Fromm, of Tom Bodamore's translation of 110 pages from Marx's 1844 essays, 23 pages from other texts by Marx, primarily the German Ideology and the Critique of Political Economy, and 40 pages of reminiscences from Marx's contemporaries. One point needs to be underlined here. This could be added to some of these myths about Fromm that you just can't, they seem irrefutable. No matter how many times you show that it's wrong, you just cannot. They just in the discourse. Despite the widely repeated legend that Fromm expresses in his introduction or elsewhere, a preference for the young Marx over the so-called mature Marx of Capital, Fromm makes no such statement anywhere in the book or later on anywhere in his work. And I've heard people say this at conferences. I guess a year ago I heard someone say, well, Fromm, he's mirror image of Althusser. Althusser loves only the Marx. After a certain point, Fromm only loved the early Marx. Actually, the prominent intellectual who did say that was not a German. It was a Frenchman, Jean-Paul Sartre, who writes in 1946 that Marx was doing really great stuff until La Néfaste, the unfortunate encounter with Engels, in the summer of 1844, after he completed the manuscript. Okay, now, in response to Marx's concept of man, some of those on the leftists who had moved a little bit in a more conservative direction, and certainly chose the Western side in the Cold War. Around this time, they were renewing their attacks on Fromm. Don't forget, McCarthyism is not quite completely faded yet, either. And they already detested Fromm for his critiques of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. They resented and resisted as well the whole new view of Marx as a radical humanist that Marx was presenting. So Fromm comes to prominence over these two things simultaneously: nuclear weapons critique and presenting the young Marx. Because earlier in 1961, just a few months earlier, Fromm had published May Man Prevail, a searing attack on nuclear weapons in which he analyzed U.S. Cold War attitudes toward the Soviet Union as an example of extreme paranoia, that collective psychology stuff. In response, Cold War liberals, like the former leftist and academic Marx specialist, former communist sympathizer, Sidney Hook, a neoconservative avant la lettre, launched a series of savage attacks accusing Fromm of opposing Western readiness. This is his words. Well, let me first say, Hook was as famous as Habermas in those days. Very fearsome guy, because he would denounce people. It was kind of almost like a commissar of culture and intellectual. I knew of him. A friend of mine tried to invite someone to speak at our university. He invited Hook. Hook said, well, who else are you inviting? And he was assistant professor. And he mentioned this other guy who was a Marxist. Hook said, well, you shouldn't invite him. Then Hook wrote a letter to the president of the university saying, you have a very incompetent young assistant professor. This is the way he operated. Okay. So a lot of people were afraid to wasn't a guy you wanted to, as a young scholar, you didn't want to get into that position. So Hooke, here's Hooke. And this is the guy who he'd helped translate Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism. He had a very famous book on Marx, in fact, more than one. Fromm is opposing our readiness to defend freedom against communist aggression as an appeaser. And not only was he an appeaser, but Fromm should also recognize, quote, that his position on defense makes the triumph of world communism easier and justifies it as the lesser evil. And in their exchange, Fromm is not a terribly polemical guy, usually. But here's part of what he says. He says, Hooke's response is a good summary of the current cliches on the promise of disarmament. And, it's a long part of a longer thing where he analyzes Hooke's paranoia and so forth. Okay. Fromm was not the first to launch a discussion of the 1844 manuscripts in English. Herbert Marcuse had analyzed them more profoundly in Reason and Revolution in 1941, already in 1941, with a chapter on alienation, although he didn't mention humanism. My mentor, Raya Dunayevskaya, continued the serious theoretical discussion with the book Marxism and Freedom, 1958, a volume that did center on the humanist interpretation of Marx, and that included the first English translation of part of the manuscripts, two of its more important essays, Private Property and Communism and Critique of the Hegelian Dialectic, but not the alienation essay. A full translation appeared in 1959 with our Progress publishers, Moscow, but it's a flawed translation in some respects, and the editorial apparatus is embarrassing. These previous discussions and translations drew relatively limited responses, however, just in the small circles of the left and certain specialist intellectuals. Fromm's stature as a public intellectual and his extremely popular form of presentation helped to spark a far wider discussion of the young Marx in the English-speaking world, not only among the broad intellectual public, but even in the mass media. Outlets like Newsweek, which is pretty much folded today, but used to be really, really big, like Der Spiegel or something. Those kinds of publications rarely discussed Marx, except like the danger of Marx or something like that. And it was positively reviewed in Newsweek. So this made Marx's Concept of Man, to this day, one of the most widely read collections of Marx's writings ever published, still used frequently in courses at universities and so forth. An interesting and sadly still relevant part of Fromm's own contribution to Marx's Concept of Man is his critique of what he terms the falsification of Marx's concepts in the mass media and even among intellectuals. And he adds, again, unfortunately, still true, this ignorance and distortion of Marx are more to be found in the United States than any other Western country. So it's like, what is this, 53 years later, you can still assign us to a class and the students go, yeah, that's right. So what are these falsifications? Okay, first of all, portraying Marx as a crude materialist who neglected the importance of the individual, of the subject. Fromm argues instead that, yes, of course, Marx is a materialist, but his aim is to liberate man from the pressure of economic needs so that he can be fully human, to overcome these modes of production that forced human beings into competition, so forth. What Fromm saw as a second falsification of Marx, and again, still with us at that time, carried out by both Western intellectuals and spokespersons for the Stalinist regimes, was the forced identification of Marx with the single-party totalitarianism of the Soviet Union and Maoist China. During the Cold War, I'm going to come back to this in intellectuals in the Cold War for a second, this led even leftist intellectuals to take sides with either the West, for example, people like Albert Camus, the Cold War liberals, or the Soviet Union in its sphere, to say, well, that was better. People like Jean-Paul Sartre, George Lukács, as the lesser evil. Fromm would have none of this, as he sharply differentiates what he calls Marxist humanist socialism on the one hand from totalitarian socialism on the other, and calls the latter, in reality, a system of conservative state capitalism, Soviet Union, Maoist China, so forth. Again, this critique on Fromm's part has relevance today in light of many attempts to tie the collapse of the Soviet Union to the demise of Marxism and Marxist thought. Now, orthodox Marxists, of course, they didn't like what Fromm was doing, but for the most part they kept silent at first because they were just so happy to see any discussion of Marx. But it was later on, of course, anti-humanist Marxists like Louis Althusser, they surely had a lot of objections to Fromm's book and to the kind of argument contained there. But it was the Cold War liberals, the so-called defenders of democracy, who took the field against Fromm's book at first. And I think it shows that the Cold War almost moved Fromm further to the left in the sense that he became increasingly antagonized and disgusted by the level of discussion inside the United States. And he was in a position where he was strong, safe enough and powerful enough that he could get away with this, and I think he took advantage of that position in a good way as a public intellectual. So I'll tell you some of the attacks, and not only from this hook. Richard Bernstein, how many people know that? A very famous American philosopher, the translator of Habermas's theory of communicative action, probably one of two or three of the people in the English-speaking world who were most identified with Habermas and whose careers were built by that association with Habermas. So here's the very young Bernstein. I mean, maybe being a little careerist here, too. He says, well, first of all, what is this young Marx? He says, this is just a series of jottings. I don't know how to translate it into German, but just like, random comments on a piece of paper. Well, that doesn't stand the test of time very well, but more interesting is the philosophical frame that Bernstein uses to attack Fromm's book. And because this actually does prefigure some of the later critiques of Marx by Habermas and the post-structuralists as well. For Bernstein also says this, that Fromm's talk in the book of human self-realization in Marx was a dangerous form of absolute humanism. Dangerous for that reason, because, as history has taught us, this can by subtle gradations turn into an absolute totalitarianism. So humanism and this Promethean humanism, this leads to totalitarian domination in the political. How many times have we heard this? And so it was for the very reason that Marx might be a humanist that his thought was dangerous, even totalitarian. What was at issue here, of course, was Bernstein's rejection of any attempt to transcend Aufheben the capitalist order, which it seemed to him would lead straight to Stalin. There is no alternative, and if you try to make one, it's going to be a disaster. Okay. Now, Sidney Hook had already attacked Hegel quite a bit. Hegel is a totalitarian Prussian philosopher, and that's part of why he really resisted, for example, Marcuse's book, Reason and Revolution. He wrote two. Normally when you review a book, you write one review, and then you see the two hostile reviews in two separate journals. So here's what Hook writes about Marx's concept of man. To seek what is this distinctive and characteristic about Marx in a period when he was still in Hegelian swaddling clothes, infant clothing, is to violate every accepted and tested canon of historical scholarship. None of these attacks seriously dented the impact of Marx's concept of man. In fact, I think it was kind of a success de scandale. The more it stirred it up, the more it actually got readers. For by now the ground was shifting toward a fuller appreciation of the whole of Marx and toward the newer type of radicalism of the 1960s that would attack not only economic exploitation and poverty, but also the alienation of even the better off part of the population and the oppressions of race, gender, and later sexuality. Now, Fromm followed up Marx's concept of man with an edited book, Socialist Humanism, an international symposium published in 1965 with Doubleday, one of the biggest U.S. publishers, like Springer, something like that. For several years afterwards, this volume was the only widely available book on socialism in the United States. It comprised essays by some 35 noted intellectuals, among them over a dozen from within Eastern Europe, most of them philosophical dissidents, but also a few who hewed more toward the party line in their various countries. In most cases, these Eastern European philosophers were appearing in English for the first time. The more dissident Eastern European Marxist humanists included several who had become prominent in the upheavals of the 1960s in the Eastern Bloc, most notably in Czechoslovakia, what was then Czechoslovakia, in 1968. Among the intellectuals from what was then Czechoslovakia were the Marxist humanist Karl Schlecht. There was just a conference held on him last month in Prague. Ivan Svitak, who later became a professor in America. Poland, represented by Bronisław Baszko. And then Adam Schaff, who was more of a he was more in the orbit of the Communist Party until the anti-Jewish campaign started in 1968. Yugoslavia in particular had a large representation. People from the so-called Praxis group, if you're familiar with that. People like Mihailo Markovic, Gajo Petrovic, Rudy Supek, and I'm not going to go into their subsequent evolution of some of them in a very un-Frommian direction. Markovic was close to the end to Slobodan Milosevic. From Western Europe, North America, and Australia, fewer, but Marxist philosophers like Marcuse, Dunayevskaya, Lucien Goldman, Ernst Bloch, Eugene Kamenka, so forth. As Fromm himself acknowledged in his introduction to the volume, it lacked very much representation from the Third World, although it did contain essays by the left-wing Gandhian Nirmal Kumar Bose and by Leopold Senghor, the president of Senegal, who espoused a non-revolutionary socialist humanism. I mean, the content varies in terms of the political frames of the various authors. Now, not everyone got their essays accepted into the volume. I mean, Fromm, maybe has a reputation as a nice guy, but when he saw something he opposed and he thought lacked rigor and the argument stood up, he had no trouble like rejecting it. So who did he reject? What young scholar was rejected? Louis Althusser. Through the mediation of Adam Schaff, Fromm invited Althusser to submit a piece, but Fromm rejected it because it was totally against the spirit of the entire volume. It was saying, well, the young Marx and humanism were childish, liberal Marx, and he later became a Marxist and rejected all that stuff. It's the whole opposite direction of the volume. And Althusser, who had his own, I can't go into his mental issues, but there is some mental instability, and I saw Renner has letters that Althusser wrote to Schaff. I mean, my essay was brilliant, it was wonderful, and yet it was rejected. I mean, so you can see some personal difficulties there. But anyway, just a footnote. So Althusser later published an essay called The Humanist Controversy. This has now appeared as a book posthumously, about how Fromm was so mean to Althusser. So you can certainly Verso Publishers has published this, but it just publishes Althusser's side of it. Now, an interesting footnote to this is it was sometimes possible to cross the Cold War divide over an intellectual principle. So Sidney Hook, the protagonist of the Cold War and nuclear weapons and so forth, and against Fromm, he was so vehemently against the young Marx that he later crossed the divide in 1973, and this is during a time when he was supporting Richard Nixon, wrote an essay praising Louis Althusser's interpretation of Marx. So you can sometimes cross over when it's a matter of principle. Okay. Now, in his own contribution to Socialist Humanism, the edited collection, Fromm spelled out more of his notion of socialist humanism, going to great lengths to show its identity with earlier forms of humanism. So he sees Marxist humanism as in continuity with other Western traditions. So here's a quote, humanism has always emerged as a reaction to a threat to mankind, in the Renaissance to the threat of religious fanaticism, in the Enlightenment to extreme nationalism and the enslavement of man by the machine and economic interests. The revival of humanism today is a new reaction to this latter threat in a more intensified form. The fear that man may become the slave of things, the prisoner of circumstances he himself has created, the subject-object inversion that Marx and Hegel talk about, and the wholly new threat to mankind's physical existence by nuclear weapons. Because that's why it becomes no longer just a class problem, because the mode of production is in a position with its weaponry to kill off everyone. Billionaires would also be killed in the nuclear holocaust. But where there was identity, there was also difference, quoting Hegel here, which Fromm didn't. But in the latter sense, Marx also stressed the core difference between socialist humanism and earlier forms of humanism. So there's also differences. Socialist humanism differs. Renaissance and Enlightenment humanism, these are Fromm's words, believe that the task of transforming man into a fully human being could be achieved exclusively or largely by education. Although Renaissance utopians touched upon the need for social changes, the socialist humanism of Karl Marx was the first to declare that theory cannot be separated from practice, knowledge from action, spiritual aims from the social system. Marx held that free and independent man could exist only in a social and economic system that by its rationality and abundance brought an end to the epoch of prehistory. In the Marxian lexicon, we're still in prehistory, as long as we have these class oppression and domination, which would make the full development of the individual the condition for the full development of society and vice versa. The latter is a paraphrase of the Communist Manifesto. Hence, Marx devoted the greater part of his life to the study of capitalist economics and the organization of the working class in the hopes of instituting a socialist society that would be the basis for the development of a new humanism. This was not the whole story, however. Marxism also had to be differentiated. Marxism itself had to be differentiated along a humanist versus crude materialist axis, with the latter not really Marxist. Again, Fromm. Marx was misinterpreted both by those who felt threatened by his program and by many socialists. The former accused him of caring only for the physical, not the spiritual needs of man. The latter, the other socialists, believed that his goal was exclusively materialist affluence for all, and that Marxism differed from capitalism only in its methods, which are economically more efficient and could be initiated by the working class. In actuality, Marx's ideal was a man productively related to other men and to nature, ecology, which would respond to the world in an alive manner, and who would be rich not because he had much, but because he was much, to be and not to have. To many then, and since such lofty goals, this is end of the quote by Fromm, articulated in such a ringing fashion were at best utopian and at worst completely outdated or even dangerous. Some of these kinds of criticisms of socialist humanism found their way into the book itself. Because Fromm wasn't making everyone toe the party line. For example, he included an essay by Herbert Marcuse, which expressed considerable doubt about the whole thing of socialist humanism. I know people think of Marcuse generally in the humanist direction, and certainly compared to structuralism. He is, but here's what he actually has to say about humanism in the essay in Fromm's volume. Now maybe, in fact, it was Fromm's volume, he wanted to emphasize this part too. Marxian theory retains an idea of man which now appears as too optimistic and idealistic. This is Marcuse. Marx underrated the extent of the conquest of nature and of man, of the technological management of freedom and self-realization. He did not foresee the great achievement of technological society, the assimilation of freedom and necessity of satisfaction and repression, of the aspirations of politics, business, and the individual. In view of these achievements, socialist humanism can no longer be defined in terms of the individual, the all-round personality, and self-determination. That era is over with. Thus, and this is my word, the success of 20th century capitalism, of the ever deeper penetration of its commodity fetish into the popular consciousness, of its Fordist high wages at the time, meant that the old revolutionary humanist ideal that underpinned Marx's thought had been superseded, aufgehoben, by the historical development of capitalism into so subtle a form of domination that even conceptualizing humanism in Marxian terms had become impossible. While Marcuse did not go the full distance of someone like Adorno and his notion of a totally administered society, because Marcuse does see more forces of opposition, in this essay Marcuse exhibited more than a flavor of that kind of thinking, as also seen in his book at that time, published a year before, One-Dimensional Man, 1964. It was while putting together Marx's Concept of Man in 1959, because Fromm started the project a couple years earlier. Fromm began his 30-year correspondence with Raya Dunayevskaya, my mentor, and that's in the book that's available here at the conference, actually, contains an interesting Marxist humanist discussion of gender. I mean, Fromm didn't write a lot about gender, but here's an interesting example. In 1976, Dunayevskaya was working on her last book, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution, published in 1982, a couple years after Fromm's death. And she writes to Fromm, she's figured out that although later after Rosa Luxemburg's death, that Lenin and Trotsky always would talk about her, but during her lifetime, there wasn't really correspondence or any kind of close relationship. And these were the three prime leaders of the left wing of the Second International. So isn't that surprising in a way? So Dunayevskaya asks about the lack of camaraderie among these three. And she asks, could there have been, if not outright male chauvinism, at least some looking down on her theoretical work because she was a woman? And here's Fromm's response. And this is one of the letters where he says, I just get out of the hospital after a heart attack and I'm not supposed to be answering letters. I think that's how the letter begins. This is 1976. I feel that the male social democrats never could understand Rosa Luxemburg, this is Fromm, nor could she acquire the influence for which she had the potential because she was a woman, and the men could not become full revolutionaries because they did not emancipate themselves from their male patriarchal and hence dominating character structure. Okay, conclusion. Fromm's life and work centered on how human beings could realize their full humanity not only in psychological terms but also politically, philosophically, economically. Always searching for a pathway out of the alienated world of capitalism, he played a major role in the discussions of Marx and of socialist humanism in the United States and internationally. Thank you.